Our presentation tonight is Art in Ruins, and presenting it is J Hogue. He has been documenting the changing architectural landscape of Northern Rhode Island for over 20 years. His presentation tonight will cover some of the history and more notable demolitions that he and others helped capture. He'll also cover the degradation of the College Hill Historic District within the blocks on the east side bounded by Brook and Waterman Streets, Thayer and Cushing Streets. So with that, we'll begin. Jay, very nice to have you.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, everybody. I have a number of slides to get through, and I'll try not to go too quickly. We'll probably save questions for the end, but also if there's something really burning question as I'm going through something, feel free to try to come off mute and let me know. But with that, I will get started here. So yeah, as was mentioned, I've been doing this for about 20 years now. Started in 2002. And so that's where I've decided to start the talk. How did this come about? Why did I start doing this in the first place? So it all really started because of an enclave of artists who went by the collective moniker Fort Thunder. They were under attack by out-of-state developers back in 2002 in a place called Eagle Square. The developers wanted to demolish about 18 or so different buildings that were built up of about 100 years and were standing for about 100 years. And that mill complex was where these artists called it home. The underground of the burgeoning creative economy at the time, really, that's where they were living. They were living on the outskirts of Providence. And they were just on the cusp of starting to storm the larger art scene on the national stage. So, and in fact, one band from that collective still records and tours and has been reviewed by the mainstream press for years. The Fort Thunder Art Collective was reviewed and interviewed and featured in the press while they were being evicted and fighting for their homes. Another art group was featured in that year's Whitney Biennial even. So they definitely went national. And through that collective and through the people that came and went to a lot of their events, other artists met each other and created projects and relationships that still reverberate today. Or from another perspective, in 2002, the city of Providence was happy to court real estate developers from all over the country that were beginning to see the value that a tightly integrated post-industrial landscape could offer the growing middle, upper middle, and parent-funded college residents of the city. A collection of squatters who called themselves artists made a big stink about raising a collection of fire traps that had long suffered from neglectful landlords who wanted to squeeze a few more bucks from the now useless shells of an industrial past that no longer existed. You can take both sides here, but either way, this event did change the course of Providence, I believe. It was the beginning of the real estate boom in the city, one that would propel a multitude of projects and spark the interest of many more to come. Out-of-state developers with that interest wanted to start to convert mill buildings and these large infrastructure structures into trending housing complex or offices. A wave of investment that came to a sudden halt 6 years later at the onset of the 2008 housing crisis, but one that still left its mark on the city. The circa 1866 Valley Worsted Mills, otherwise known as Eagle Square, were not completely saved, but more buildings in the complex were rehabilitated into commercial and residential space than the original plan called for, because of that stink that the artists and preservationists started to raise. So mills along Valley Street and Kinsley close by were saved and converted into housing as well, including the Providence Dyeing and Bleaching and Calendaring Company, the National Providence and Worsted Mills, the Armington and Sims Engine Company, and Providence Steel and Iron and Buildings Iron Foundry, and more further away. But this is just a selection of some of the ones that had a ripple effect in the area. Eagle Square taught some artist groups to start to band together, form partnerships, and get into real estate themselves. The Plant, formerly the Providence Dyeing, Bleaching, and Countering Company, was one of those projects. The Steel Yard, formerly the Providence Steel and Iron and Builders Iron Foundry, was another. Firehouse 13, formerly the Goodwill Engine Company. The Hive Archive and the recent conversion of the Kendrick Prentice Tarochi House. And the U.S. Rubber Lofts, to name a few, would not have happened if it were not for a group of artists at the helm of each. Simultaneously, the investment that was made in and around these projects propelled other high-profile preservation projects like the Masonic Temple, now a Marriott Hotel, the South Street Power Station, now finally a joint venture between Brown University, Rhode Island College, and the University of Rhode Island, the Royal Mills in Warwick, and Pearl Street Lofts, formerly the former New England Butt Company, and again, many more. Somehow, luckily, we saw this coming. We saw the writing on the wall back in 2002. And some of it was quite literally writing on walls. And we saw how the charming, gritty, somewhat crumbling, but still beautiful city was changing. We saw that some of it would get cleaned up, sanitized, and made new, while other parts of it would retain its gritty industrial past while adapting to a less industrial future. We started to take photos. We started to interview people that worked in these spaces, and we started this website to share the way that we saw the beauty in the decay, the art among the ruins, and the artists who lived within them. So our mission became simply to document and comment on the change, especially in the beginning. For me, photography was a side passion, and getting early access to many of these crumbling buildings throughout the city was electrifying. Some we gained access to easily, though not with anyone's permission, and some we did get permission. Exploring the hulking shell of the Masonic Temple, for instance, was one scary but exhilarating adventure. Eventually, as the site grew and more folks in the real estate game got to know us, we were invited to tour spaces under construction or before any work had begun. And some of these were fascinating tours. In parallel, we made friends with members of the preservation community, often being confided in as unattached and punk rock as we were, able to say things and promote positions that they felt they couldn't. So our work began slowly, with only 14 properties added in the first year. But in the second year, we added another 30 and started to get more serious about the history we would add to these properties. We became outspoken preservationists who tried to balance the architecture critique within the discourse, who at that time was really a one-person show. It was largely driven by the Providence Journal's David Brusset. And we enjoyed trading comments about some of the buildings and some of the things that were happening in the city at the time. He seems to love anything brick and insisted that new construction be brick, brick, and more brick, and certainly not modern in appearance. We sought to try to balance that outlook, praising some of the new architecture for being new and different, while fiercely defending the old that deserved to be saved. Our site now, artandruins.com, has over 300 properties and many, many tags and ways that you can explore those properties by location or by type. So our documentation is built upon the work of others. I want to be the first to admit that, which is why when speaking of Art and Ruins, I often speak in the collective we. A few years into creating this project, I realized its purpose as a documentarian was, well, to collect and make it easy to put all the hard work that other people have put into these documentation projects together in one place. The National Register nomination forms, the well-researched 10 most endangered write-ups, the maps in various libraries and collections. We tried our best to highlight the most interesting information and to point to the research that was completed by folks much smarter and more dedicated than us. Another surreptitious part of the project, though, was the anecdotes. 2002 was still fairly early in the world of the internet. We added reference points for places that were likely not mentioned many other places. So when retirees came online, often they found our pages. They Googled the companies that they used to work for, and they found it. They left us stories that other people would find. And in a few cases, conversations that spanned years were had in the comment section, trading old stories and reminiscing about the characters that they worked with. For some reason, the discourse was always very respectful, and we never had to battle comment spam or overheated arguments on our pages. So that's a little bit about why it started, how it started, and what spurred it on. And now I'd like to transition over to some of the properties that I think are the most interesting or significant for lots of different reasons, not only because they might be historically significant. So I'd like to start with the Cove Basin. Not exactly something that you would think of as a building, and because it's literally not, but it has a very interesting story, and it's at the center of the city's renaissance recently, Providence. So it's one of the oldest properties that I have on the site, actually. And its existence was a natural part of the land when Providence was founded and changed dramatically over time as more and more land was filled in between the riverfront and Smith Hill. The Cove, as it was called, was located behind the first Union Station. And now, in fact, it sits under the current Union Station. It was frequently dredged as it served as a dumping ground, especially in the 1800s, for the city's cast-offs, including, unfortunately, lots of deceased horses. So in order to trace its history and understand it as how it evolved from a natural feature into more of a man-made and controlled feature, I painstakingly traced historic documents to unify and visualize the evolution of the cove starting in 1823. So this is before its outline was heavily filled in and, again, manicured by the city founders. So this is what it looked like in 1823 and what most of downtown looked like in the center in the darker yellow at the time as well. As I move through, the cove will change shape drastically, but also you'll start to see a lot of fill being added to the industrial waterfront as well. So the next version of this is 1849, only about 20 or so years later. But you can see how quickly things had changed. A shape that represents and kind of resembles what Water Place Park is now was previously a feature in roughly the same location. Notice, I'll go into detail a little bit further later on, but notice right over here is the first Union Station and just a few railroad tracks ringing around it. That's going to change quite a bit as well. By 1889, about 60 years later, its size was significantly reduced and it became a designed water feature, unnaturally circular, and ringed by more and more train tracks. By 1937, the second Union Station is in place, and Exchange Terrace or Exchange Place or Kennedy Plaza was out in front of it. Notice all of the rails now and how the waterway has simply shrunk to just the Woonasquatucket River and where it meets the Mahasek. Now at 2005, a little bit of that circular shape came back. The redesign of Water Place Park, coupled with the removal of all those elevated train tracks running in front of the State House, revived the circular cove. And I'll show this all again very quickly, but this is the kind of transformation I really enjoy being able to see and experience how things have changed over time. I'll go through this again, but I'll zoom in on these maps now. So again, here's the Cove, here's downtown, Westminster Street. We move along, a lot of development downtown, but also a lot of new development up in the lands that have recently been filled in around the Cove. Just keeps getting smaller, city keeps getting bigger. And now we have it almost gone. And now we have current state. So now we're back in 2005 after the Providence Renaissance. The north-south split created by the train tracks previously has been replaced by the west-east split of the interstate highway. But that's another story. Now I'd like to shift from landscape back into buildings. We have one of the 5 industrial wonders of the world, Gorham Manufacturing, the largest metalworking foundry at its time. Gorham is best known for silverwork, from plated cutlery to tea sets to the Davis Cup, if there's any tennis fans out there, as well as bronze castings and statues, including the Independent Man atop the State House, which was cast in 1899. The Smithsonian Archives of American Art list Gorham Foundry items over 700 times in its inventory of American sculpture. Gorham was an expansive complex built around 1890 and retained much the same configuration throughout its entire life. It was a 37-acre site that included over 30 buildings located between the Mashapaug Pond and Adelaide Avenue in the Reservoir Triangle neighborhood of Providence. It was in continuous operation until 1986, when Textron Corporation, the owners since 1967, decided to close the plant. The Gorham Company was founded as a small jeweler's shop in 1818 by Jabez Gorham, who made beads and earrings, breastpins, rings, and gold chain. By 1831, the firm began manufacturing silver spoons, and soon after, the production of additional silver items. The company was incorporated in 1865. The complex, which included one of the largest metalworking foundries in the world, consisted of a group of 2- and 3-story brick structures with low, hip, or pitched roofs, grouping for the most part symmetrically beside and behind a 3-story hip-roofed office building entrance, seen here. All the structures possessed uniform corbelled brick cornices and windowsills and other trimmings of rock-faced granite. It was really a lovely set of structures. Inside were massive foundry equipment and space to do all sorts of castings. Gorham actually established a separate department for the manufacture of ecclesiastical articles starting in 1885. And that department was so successful that it started getting larger and larger orders for statues and memorials and for architectural bronze work. One of the many statues cast here actually was the 1893 Columbus Monument at Columbus Square in Elmwood, which was a replica of a silver statue designed by Auguste Bartholdi and cast at Gorham as well, but for the Columbian Exposition of 1892 in Chicago. After its exit and closure in 1986, the city of Providence acquired the complex at a tax foreclosure sale by 1992. The city then spent the next 6 years looking for a proper redevelopment plan for the site. During the summer of 97, the Preservation Society and the city mailed out 1,600 brochures seeking proposals to developers all over New England. But by the deadline, only 10 developers expressed interest, and none of them wanted to save the buildings. And so the Gorham complex came to be demolished. Instead, a Stop and Shop was built in its place, and it unfortunately has since moved out. In a slightly different part of the city, another one of the 5 industrial wonders of the world was the American Screw Company. This company was organized in 1860 and immediately purchased the property of the former Eagle Screw Company and the New England Screw Company, one from 1840 and the other from 1850. This conglomerate then became the American Screw Company. It was by far the largest manufacturer of its kind, again, in the country, if not the world. It had the capacity to produce about 40,000 gross of wood screws, several tons of rivets, and large quantities of machine screws every day. It employed up to 2,500 people at its height. Shown here is the former Bay State Mill, built 1873, and thought to be designed by Thomas Tefft. Shown here is the Eagle Screw Company, built 1840, another part of the complex. By 1949, though, the screw company moved their operations to Willimantic, Connecticut. The building survived intact and had plans for reuse and redevelopment until a July 1971 fire swept through the complex, leaving just mostly charred shells. Today, unfortunately, none of the buildings remain. Although not part of the original group of buildings on the National Register nomination form, building number 6 up the hill survives today as part of the Groden Center on North Main Street. It was briefly part of the American Screw Company. These photos were used in one of our then and now posts that we did for Instagram. So switching over to sports, I'd like to introduce the Providence Cyclodrome. Just what is a cyclodrome, you might ask? Well, it's a banked wooden track for bicyclists. And interestingly, this one, as you might see from the photo, had a football field in the middle of it. Not many photos of this one survive, and this uncredited photo is one that has been circulating the most. The track was designed to hold 13,000 fans, which was making it the largest bicycle track anywhere in the country at the time. It was built by Peter Laudati, a prominent Providence real estate developer. Laudati was an ardent promoter of sports ventures. So in addition to the cyclodrome, he built Providence's Kinsley Park, which was home to the Providence Grays baseball team in the 1930s. He was instrumental in bringing Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig to play an exhibition game at that park. And he was also part owner of the Providence Steamroller NFL franchise. Yeah, you heard that right. The Providence Steamroller NFL franchise lasted from 1916 to 1931. The Steamroller were short-lived as a team, but left a lasting impression on football. They were the first team to play 4 regular season games in only 6 days. The first team to play a night game under electric floodlights, which was November 6, 1929, and the first New England team to win the NFL championship way back in 1928. Games, it was known, were regularly packed. Providence set an early NFL attendance record of 13,000 people for a game against the New York Giants, which the Steamroller handily won. Capacity crowds meant that fans sat so close to the field that players who were chased out of bounds might end up in their laps. One source suggested that ardent Steamroller supporters were responsible for a fair share of injuries to the unlucky opponents. Despite their 1928 championship, though, the team experienced troubles in 1929 and only had a 7th place finish. The lack of interest and the onset of the Great Depression caused the owners to suspend operations after the 1931 season. In 1937, Laudati redeveloped the track into one of the nation's first drive-in movie theaters. In this image mashup, you can see the 1939 aerial photo underneath showing the rings of car parking for the drive-in overlaid with the 1937 GM Hopkins cadastral map of the perimeter of where the cyclodrome track was located. And finally, we would be remiss if we did not touch upon Rhode Island's long history as an important and strategic military location. Quonset Point Naval Air Station was established as part of the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, shortly before the U.S. entered World War II. It served as a major northeastern naval base during the war and subsequent years. During its heyday, Quonset's workforce, combined with that of the adjacent Davisville Construction Battalion Center, was the largest in the state of Rhode Island. Some of the remaining structures after demolitions in the 1970s, including Seaplane Hangar No. 1 and the enlisted barracks, were designed by renowned industrial architect Albert Kahn and are among southern Rhode Island's architecturally significant structures. On Monday, April 16th, 1973, the Department of Defense told the members of the Rhode Island delegation that facilities in Newport would be reduced sharply and that Quonset Point would be closed completely. Many people had felt that the base's strategic location would save it, but the Navy said that the bay was too shallow for the new, much larger aircraft carriers. So the Navy left the base by 1974. Since the closing, though, the state has pursued developing the base as an industrial park quite successfully. Since the 1980s, many of the industrial facilities were used by the Electric Boat Division of General Dynamics, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and is now known as the Quonset Business Park. It's currently home to almost 200 companies, employing more than 11,000 people across a variety of industries. And the port at Davisville at Quonset is one of the top 10 auto importers in North America. So all of this history happens in this little state. So with history at our backs, it's time to review more properties and significant structures that we have lost in more recent times. And one of the things that I'll be talking about quite a bit is something that we in the preservation community, which maybe you do as well, called demolition by neglect. And it does have some siblings, I would say. This one is an example of demolition by proposal. So this first story involves the buildings at 90 Westminster Street, which would have been eligible for individual listing on the National Register. But it was already listed in the Downtown Historic District, the Providence National Bank. It was significant because of its quality of an example of a Georgian revival commercial architecture during the early 20th century, and the fact that it was built to be the headquarters of Rhode Island's oldest bank, which was incorporated in 1791. A proposed new 32-story condo called the 110 Westminster was supposed to be built on this spot. The $90 million tower would have been the first skyscraper built in the financial district in over 20 years, since the Fleet Center at 100 Westminster Street, which was built in 1984. The top of the tower even was planned to be taller than the neighboring Industrial Trust Tower by almost 100 feet. The building design, too, was supposed to incorporate the remaining facade of the Weybosset Street side of the former building into its design. But now that facade is the only part of the building that remains. Another example is here to show that being listed and being known doesn't mean that it may avoid demolition. Despite being listed on the National Register, the Atlantic Blue Coal Storage Towers were granted a demolition permit request without any time for review by mistake. The silos were used for coal storage, and the land that we're located on is currently only being used for parking. One reaction that was submitted to us said it very well. I drove by today and that tall, rippling wall of concrete no longer rose above the horizon. Did I miss them? I drove back. Backhoes were crawling at odd angles on the stumps of the silos, loading the concrete debris into dump trucks. I was stunned. We get so excited about mills, which is really a catch-all word for industrial buildings. But what about industrial engineering resources and infrastructure? Big cities are losing historic food and fuel resources, places where bulk commodities were brought in by ship and rail, stored, and distributed. These were vital civic organs at the time. Today in Europe, they're preserved and celebrated for what they are, these monuments, these gigantic outdoor urban sculptures. But here, they too often get called an eyesore. A different demolition by proposal, or accident, it's understandable that these things might happen, but they also can happen by brute force without going through the proper channels. This example is a former school building on the west side of Providence that had been privately owned and used lightly only for storage. It was an eyesore in the neighborhood, The family sought a demolition permit, but were denied it because it was a contributing structure in a historic district that was created in 1988. So one weekend, 2006, they started to tear it down without a permit. If it weren't for members of the West Broadway Neighborhood Association who caught wind of it and called the authorities to get it stopped, the whole building would have come down immediately. But unfortunately, the damage had been done. Even with half of one of the walls gone, though, the building stayed upright for a few more years. Exposed to the elements, it remained. And then finally, after a few years of neglect and no attempt to mitigate any of the damage, the family won a judge's order for demolition. It should be noted that members of the family here were also attorneys who worked for the city. Why would an attorney break the law and show and allow an illegal demolition to take place? Well, maybe because the fine at only $5,000 is not enough of a deterrent. And that's also evident in this next case. So what does it cost to file the paperwork, wait for the approval, and deal with the Historic District Commission that may not grant you the approval to remove a building? What if you're a real estate developer who can afford to pay the penalty? Because every day represents parking fees that you could not collect unless the building was gone. Well, that's the story of this unique little circular structure that was at the corner of Broadway and Atwells in front of what was the Holiday Inn and is now a Hilton in downtown Providence. Edward Ned Connors, a frequent contributor to National Register nomination forms, said in an op-ed that was aired on WRNI when this building came down, without any public notice, a demolition crew came in, and before any effective response could be mounted, this roadside landmark was gone. To some, yes, it was just a gas station, functional, quirky, but probably aesthetically invisible or even ugly to some. To others, it was a rare and interesting example of mid-century commercial architecture, sort of a space-age circular plan visible from all angles. I should note as well, the real estate developer here was Paolino Properties, who was also responsible for our next tragedy. The Union Traction Electric Company built this large streetcar depot and repair shop for its electric trolley fleet back in 1900. By 1918 or 1938, depending on the source, the nearby Narragansett Brewery purchased the building and the land to use it as storage and repair for its own delivery fleet. And from here on in, it's known as either the Cranston Street Trolley Barn or the Narragansett Trolley Barn. After a very successful run, and due to increasing competition from larger national brands, however, as we all know, Narragansett Brewery closed its doors and laid off its workforce. The larger complex and the trolley barn's fate were uncertain at the time. By 1988, the rest of the plant was demolished, but the trolley barn was spared for possible redevelopment. And it was just a massive structure, and one of the few as well that I was able to get into on my own and explore. Just an amazing piece of infrastructure at the time. But unfortunately, in 2003, the city of Cranston officially had to condemn the building for some, shall we say, convenient or inconvenient fires that happened on the property. The real estate developer was in negotiations to develop a nearby site at the time for a new police headquarters, after successfully turning the former brewery land into a Lowe's and a Stop and Shop. Local preservation groups were vocal about reusing the structure. But again, that arson that was reported at the scene made everyone stand up and take notice. They couldn't imagine and wouldn't want the entire structure to go up in flames. It was kind of convenient in the way that the massive structure at the same time was not properly closed up or guarded against such vandalism. And to my true sadness, since its demolition in 2005, still nothing has been built upon the site. where it sat. So the last sad story that I wanted to tell is about the former Providence Fruit and Produce Warehouse Company that was located along Harris Avenue. This warehouse represented the last major component of an important historic district, the Provisions Warehouse District. If a developer with vision could have redeveloped a structurally sound but completely unfinished and vagrant-infested Masonic temple, why not this building? The thick, reinforced concrete building had an underground tunnel connecting it to another massive building that was in the district across the street, the Merchant's Cold Storage Building, which was literally a refrigerated building. This one was in continuous use by the Providence Produce Warehouse Company and its tenants from its construction in 1929. One of the longest running businesses to operate it was the Tortolot Company, who was there from opening day. The warehouse had been acquired by the state DOT in 1998 at a cost of about $14 million. It was purchased in order to loop the mall's off-ramp around the building. As state and federal money purchased this structure, which was listed on the National Register, the state could not knock it down completely. Instead, a section of about 100 feet was lopped off the end in order to make room for the off-ramp, and now the state had to figure out what to do with the rest of it. In 2004, they put the building out for bid and received one from Carpianato Properties for a Quincy Market concept. The state agreed to the development and also to take a $10 million loss by accepting a $4.5 million offer. But about a year later, Carpianato submitted a drastically modified plan for the property, calling for demolishing 700 of the 810-foot building, adding a large retail big box store on the ground floors instead, and building two 12-story hotel towers, rising 120 to 150 feet. A year later, in 2007, Providence building official Kerry Anderson issued a letter ordering Carpianato to obtain a demolition permit after seeing how the perimeter had been breached in several places and was being inhabited by vagrants and vandals, which sounds familiar. Earlier in 2005, there was a significant fire in the building, which led to the inspection. Carpianato had not been keeping the building secure, likely on purpose. By doing nothing, they get what they wanted. Lawyers went back and forth, but a judge's order prevailed in favor of demolition. And in January 2008, it started to come down. So even though the building was purchased with state money, and even though it was listed on the National Register, was documented by the Historic American Building Survey and Historic American Engineering Record, and was listed 5 times on the 10 most endangered list, it still came down. And these are, to someone's point from when we get started, some of the sad realities of doing this kind of work. But I'm still happy and proud to have been able to document a lot of these things, to put it in writing, and to make all of the hard work of others present and available that were able to describe a lot of these buildings and why they were significant. So while those were significant losses in our eyes, our opinion is not the only opinion that matters. Viewers of the site over the years have picked their favorites by leaving many comments on or making some of these properties the most frequently visited pages on the site. So I'll go through a few of those pretty quickly, and some of them I hope are very familiar to you all. With about 58 images and 154 anecdotes submitted since 2002, Rocky Point Park is by far the most commented property on the site. So much so that I no longer post every comment that comes in, but instead try to focus on ones that add additional value or context. Almost every Rhode Islander of a certain age has a story about Rocky Point. The former Jamestown Bridge, which was blown up by dynamite in 2006, has 17 images and 67 anecdotes, and I've started to collect those since 2004. People love to reminisce about this narrow bridge with the open grading roadway that would sway a little bit under high winds. Another local theme park, Crescent Park in East Providence, gathered 23 images and 56 anecdotes. And again, people love an amusement park that was literally in many of their backyards. Of which, it should be noted, the carousel is still in operation. This hand-carved carousel, built in 1895 by Charles Loof at his Brooklyn, New York factory, was installed at the Crescent Amusement Park and then moved later on to this location. So tied for anecdotes with Crescent Park are 3 former Chinese restaurants located in Providence's downtown. With 13 images and 15 anecdotes, people since 2008 have been trying to figure out what made the fried chicken wings at Ming's Garden so fantastic. Folklore and new people just learning that Providence has a tunnel running under it, running under most of College Hill, love these 21 images and 19 stories about the now defunct train tunnel. This also represents a time when downtown was full of infrastructure and strange traffic patterns such as Suicide Circle. The aerial view here is looking east from about Exchange Place, Kennedy Plaza. The Soldiers and Sailors Monument in the foreground is in front of the Providence, Washington Insurance Company building, which in this photo is nearing completion, which puts it around 1950. This is part of one of my favorite collections housed at the Providence Public Library in their digital archive. Mentioned previously before a little bit, the Narragansett Brewery is another popular one on the site with some pretty great stories submitted. Though low anecdote counts, again, this one gets many views, and some of these stories from folks who used to work there are just the best. So with only 5 images and only 2 anecdotes, I still wanted to mention this one because it was a really interesting one, because the architect ended up finding our page and leaving a pretty detailed comment about why this particular building started to fail. So this was a indoor swimming center at Brown University, built in the 1970s, that had a unique hyperbolic roof system made of triangles overlapping and interweaving, which allowed for a clear interior space of 130 feet wide by 325 feet deep. That is an amazing clear span inside a building like this. Since it was a swim center, though, it required ventilation to prevent humidity from rotting away the wood beams, which is exactly what ended up happening. So after I posted this page and a news story that was, I guess, not as well informed as it could be, the architect and engineer Daniel Tully sent me an anecdote saying, during the time that I was asked to investigate the troubles noticed in 2007, I found that someone perhaps 20 years earlier had cut the humidistat wiring. The humidity control system was a simple one. When the humidity on the inside rose too high, 6 exhaust fans would kick on and lower the humidity significantly. In a misplaced zeal to save energy during the crisis in the 70s, some consultants simply cut the control wiring. This madness may have saved Brown University a few dollars at the time, but it cost them a wonderful building. And I just really love that. I really love that the architect was looking for his work and found our page. Now, I want to boost morale a little bit and talk about some significant saves. We mentioned the Masonic Temple earlier because the story is still just really fascinating. Oops, sorry about that. And the structure itself is magnificent. A brick and limestone building with a neoclassical design. Construction started in 1926 for the local chapter of the Freemasons, who were supposed to move from their 1897 building on Dorrance Street. But the project was abandoned during the onset of the Great Depression in 1928, along with its neighbor, the now Veterans Memorial Auditorium. The building would sit open for a little more than 10 years before the state started to explore acquisition of the project. A $750,000 bond was approved by voters in 1942, and construction started in 1949. The carving seen here was likely added during that time. Governor John Pastori signed a bill dedicating one of the buildings as the Veterans Memorial Building and providing free office space for chartered veterans associations. The plan was to put office space in the Masonic Temple and to open the auditorium as an auditorium. So while that did go forward and open in 1950, long-range plans to finish the temple as office space never materialized. So 40 years later, in 1994, the building was listed on the first ever 10 most endangered properties list by the Providence Preservation Society, and it would be included every year until 2003. Finally, in 2004, plans were completed on an extensive renovation into a hotel, which included replacing the entire interior structure seen here. In April of 2007, the temple opened as a Marriott Renaissance Hotel with 272 luxury rooms. The massive former power plant on South Street had a similar life and similar road to saving as the Masonic Temple, being open to the elements as its future was tossed around for about 20 years. This aerial photo is from 1956 and is from the Providence Public Library digital collection as well. In 1991, the plant was decommissioned and smaller features of the site, like those coal conveyors, were demolished. The tall smokestacks were removed as well, but the rest of the building remained. As early as 1994, the interest of a group called the Heritage Harbor Museum, who wanted to convert the property into a state history museum, led the Narragansett Electric Company to donate the building to them. The museum started fundraising for a $1.5 million renovation needed to complete the exterior and make it weather-tight. The massive interior spaces were to house large exhibition pieces like a fishing ship. As many as 19 businesses and cultural organizations joined the coalition in developing the proposed museum, and it becomes one of the first 12 museums in the Smithsonian Affiliates Program, which means the museum would have had access to the Smithsonian's 140 million artifacts for temporary exhibitions. Despite this positivity and enthusiasm, though, the museum never opens. In 2005, an out-of-state developer, drawn to the many mills available for residential conversions, set its sights on the massive space. Its name was to be the Dynamo House. Striever Brothers, Eccles and Rouse from Baltimore planned to create a mix of office, retail space, and 40 condominium units, as well as some exhibition space for the Heritage Harbor Museum. The project at the time was estimated to cost about $137 million. Construction started and stopped. Tax credits were denied by the National Park Service because the interior changes to the structure were too great. But the financial collapse of 2008 put the project on hold, and SPER defaulted on the project loans in 2009. The structure was now exposed to the elements for the next 7 years, having had all of its windows removed and ready for replacements. But luckily, it was finally reborn as a public-private partnership between 3 universities, and now called South Street Landing. In 2009, it was awarded the Richard H. Driehaus Foundation National Preservation Award from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And I've been inside, and it's just remarkable how it retains a lot of the industrial history and feel of it, as well as being a modern take on office and teaching spaces. I want to shift a little down to downtown Providence. The story here is interesting as well, because as retail moved away from the downtown core and businesses moved away for larger campuses outside the city, Providence had to think about how it was going to reinvent itself. A ghost town, usually after 5 o'clock and on the weekends, it was still full of lots of beautiful buildings that deserved a second life. So failed attempts to remake the downtown into a shopping center of its own right didn't stop the exodus to the malls. In these archival photos, an outdoor pedestrian mall replaced Westminster Street for a time, which was the first pedestrian mall in New England. In both of these photos, the building on the left is the former Woolworths, then Peerless department store, then Lupo's Heartbreak Hotel. The experiment lasted from 1964 actually until 1986 and spawned a few copycats, but failed to remake downtown into a new retail hub. The competing Midland Mall from 1968 and Warwick Mall from 1972 continued to draw shoppers and businesses away from downtown. A reimagining was needed to bring residential life to it instead. Certainly, it wasn't pretty for a while. Commercial styles in the 1970s left many of the buildings covered by false facades. The dated look of this treatment left many to wonder, who would want to live downtown? The transformation was largely driven by one developer, Arnold Buff Chase, and his company Cornish Associates, who personally managed the transformation of many of the buildings we showcase here. If not for his initial investment, many other developers would have invested elsewhere as well. So Chase's vision was spurred on by a 1994 report called Down City Providence, Master Plan and Implementation. The report was crafted by Andre Duany and Elizabeth Palter Zyberg, both best known for their pioneering work in something called New Urbanism. The report led to the development of the Westminster Street as a mixed-use commercial and residential corridor, shifting from heavily commercial to heavily residential. It helped the city create the Down City Arts and Entertainment District, which was passed by then Mayor Cianci in 1996. This program was the first of its kind in the country. And now we want to quickly mention Vesta Knitting Mills and Colonial Knife. These were one of the earlier residential mill conversions that we know of. The building was converted for ground floor commercial use and upper floor residential condominiums by the early 90s, way before it was trendy. This 1893 factory with an attached 1903 factory building manufactured ribbed knitted underwear and hosiery made on circular knitting machines. Rudolph Berry's company started in a small two-story building in 1883, but quickly outgrew it and had 300 employees by 1891. This was the building that some of you may remember had a fake window and a bubble perspective painted on the side of it, which was sadly removed. It was certainly one of my favorite features. In this photo, too, it should be noted that the brick detail in the cornice and the band at the window transom height and the corner brickwork are all trompe l'oeil. They don't actually exist. That's a cinder block building. When it built this mill for itself, the Vesta Knitting Mills overbuilt and rented space to other firms who wanted to be located within the jewelry district. This business plan drove the construction of another structure only 10 years later. In 1941, the now called Vesta Underwear Company closed its plant and sold the building to the Imperial Knife Company, who already occupied the adjacent structure. The knife company was the first large American manufacturer of jackknives, a product which had previously been imported from Germany and England. In 1929, they employed about 1,000 workers. The Imperial Knife Company, which grew to manufacture all kinds of cutlery, occupied the buildings until they closed in 1987. It was shortly then turned into residential, as I mentioned. This next one, this last one of the significant saves, is a wonderful ornate building known as the Wedding Cake House on the west side. It was then home, after it was built, it was home to street railway tycoon George Prentice in the 1880s. And by 1815, it was the former workshop of notable designers A and L Tarocchi, dress designing and making sisters, who became the home's most significant occupants. They catered to wealthy clients until 1947, with a storefront in the Butler Exchange building downtown. The third floor of the house served as a workshop where the sisters and helpers fabricated, decorated, beaded, altered, and tailored clothing. The sisters employed women from thriving Italian-American families. For these young women, the sewing rooms were safe areas where women were sheltered from exploitation and bad behavior and were under the supervision of 2 female members of their own community. When Anna died in 1947, Laura wrapped all the shop's records and carefully put them away. Not until 1989, curators from the Rizzi Museum were invited by Laura's son, who inherited the house and knew the value of what was left behind. When they entered, it was a time capsule. Everything from the shop's operation lay untouched for over 40 years. Such complete documentation of a historical dressmaking business exists nowhere else in the United States. After 2 false starts involving bankruptcies and foreclosures, the home was sold to a female-led artist group known as the Dirt Palace. They turned the residence into a living museum space, and many artists contributed to its rebirth. Art is on the walls, in the floors, and among the furniture in all the spaces. The group hosts an artist in residency program, private art studios, exhibition space, and short-term rentals for a few rooms that they list through Airbnb. Now, looking forward, we want to shift focus a little bit to some of the ongoing developments and trends that we see happening in the area. And I know we're coming up to an hour, so I'll try to make this brief. So, as was mentioned in the introduction, one of the essays we've been tracking and writing is about the erosion of the College Hill Historic District. So, in Providence, on the so-named College Hill, residents have been pushing back on what is usually called institutional creep, the slow growth of the Rhode Island School of Design and Brown University campuses. As each one expands, the city loses taxable real estate and residents deal with more students in smaller, denser areas with larger and larger buildings around. Few smaller houses remain, as this dramatic set of photos illustrates. In the span of 10 years, these 2 blocks bounded by Thayer, Cushing, Brook, and Euclid lost 21 houses. The large building to the left is the new Brown University Student Wellness Center, which contains dorm rooms as well. To the left is a privately funded development of student housing occupying almost the entire block. In fact, this little 235 Meeting Street house, circa 1896, was recently demolished as well, leaving only 2 historic properties on that entire block of what was once 10. 2 blocks south is no better. All of these redevelopments were private, however, which is sort of that halo effect of institutional creep. Because demand to live off campus is high, private developers can make a sure bet that upgraded amenities and denser housing will find tenants. Many of these were demolitions, but a few were expansions of existing properties to make them bigger and taller. In fact, it's almost easier to circle the ones that have not changed. There we go. The ones not circled are either not historically significant or they're buildings who have been expanded and renovated beyond their historic recognition. So again, in a short span of 10 years, these 2 blocks have lost 8 historic resources, and actually they're about to lose 2 more. Those 2 right there. Those 2 properties have just been granted demolition this past February in favor of a larger, taller, single apartment building. Now, this house is one of the newest losses that will be coming to these 4 blocks, which is a handsome square plan, 2.5-story, double hip roof dwelling with some lovely but simple details built around 1860s. Its neighbor to the north is also planned for demolition, but this is a less attractive house that's been modified from its original plan. Notice the replacement windows, especially the swing-out windows on the first floor. In many ways, it's easy to see why some folks don't care that these houses will be gone. They've not been maintained in accordance with their historic status, and there are no existing statutes to support someone in doing that or punish them if they don't. When a landlord wants to get rents for very little investment, their properties start to look bland and unexciting from the outside. Now, before I complain too much about modern architecture, I do want to be clear. I am a fan of modern architecture, but of course, that is to say, good modern architecture. And I know that sounds very privileged. There have been some good new buildings added to the city in recent years. The G-Tech building around Water Place Park, I quite like. Same with this building, the Wexford Science and Innovation Center. New buildings can be way more energy and resource efficient than older buildings if the developer cares about such things. The problem is many do not. They can make a statement like this building does, being in stark but dramatic and pleasing contrast from their industrial red brick mill neighbors, or they can be cheaply made and out of place, looking like they're plopped down from a catalog with no relationship to their surroundings, easily at home here or in any suburban strip mall. And that's why we've not been too pleased with most of the new architecture coming around in the city and some of the state. Doesn't need to look old, but it needs to look like something. It needs to have an opinion, point of view, and to present a pleasing contrast with its historic counterparts. At least that's our opinion about it. Now I'd like to start to close up, and I wanted to make a mention that while I've been talking about all this, and I've been using the royal we to talk about folks that have been helping me along the way, I welcome more contributions. I welcome anecdotes, of course, but every now and then someone who is motivated enough comes along and gives me enough to build a property page from the research that they've done, the photos that they've taken, or they've done enough research like someone I had met, unfortunately their name is escaping me right now, who gave me most of the information for Crescent Park because they wrote a book about it. So these kinds of things are really lovely, and I do want to make it very clear that this is not meant to be a one-person show. If other people would like to get involved and lend their expertise, I notice, and it's pretty glaringly obvious now that I don't have any properties in East Greenwich yet. I would like to change that. Getting involved is always something that would be welcome from anyone in the state who has something that they would like to contribute. And with that, thank you very much for your time this evening. Thank you for taking the ride along with me.
All right. Well, thank you, Jay. That was a very nice presentation.